Alright guys, going into C Sharp, looking at the homework, although the title of the homework for 3 said create a console application, the instructions themselves said to create a WPF application. And if you looked at it, it was the same exact thing as the WPF application, so you may have been confused as to what the difference was. Well, it was supposed to be a console application, so I've modified the instructions. If you got confused and turned into WPF applications, that's okay. I'm not going to count you wrong. You don't have to redo it. So barreling forth into Chapter 3, using the GUI and the Visual Studio IDE. So our objectives: create a form. Use the toolbox to add a button to a form. We really know how to do all this. Add labels and text boxes to the form. Name your forms and controls. Correct errors. And decide which interface to use. So the interface is the environment that the user sees. What are forms? Rectangular graphical user interface objects. See, if we were octopuses, maybe all windows would be round or something. Humans like squares. They're easier to program. So what we do is we do a new project. We choose Windows Form Application. Now we've been doing WPF applications. So I'll be kind of curious to see how much this differs. Let's go ahead and pop open Visual Studio and choose a Windows Form Application, which should be remarkably similar. And I'm trusting y'all with 2017 to tell me if it looks weird, okay? Alrighty. So hitting a web page and looking at the difference between WinForms and WPF looks like about the big difference is that if you use WPF, you can use XML to create and edit your GUI, which allows the work to be split between a designer and a programmer. Kind of the same thing as if you're using CSS and style sheets. Well, style sheets are CSS. The JavaScript developer actually codes this stuff, whereas the CSS, the GUI developer, pops open Dreamweaver or whatever and creates an incredible user interface for it. So what's the cons of using a WPF? Requires a .NET framework, still in an evolving phase. I don't know when this was written. Requires a DX9 compatible video card for advanced graphics. Well, I hope everything is compatible nowadays. This had to have been written a while back. So anyways, let's go on. There's our form. This is looking very similar to what we did before, because it is. So what we have, like we can see this, so we have our menu bar up at the top, of course. We have our Solution Explorer down the side, which you might minimize or close, which has a project name. And then we have our Properties window, just where it was before, where you can change the properties of the items. So the name of the application shows in 3 places. It shows up in the title bar, the Solution Explorer, and the Properties window. And the Toolbox tab provides a list of controls you can drag onto a form. View, toolbars. I'm not seeing that tab on my version of it, so I'm going to just go over to other windows. Pardon me?
Under notification or above notifications for
Right there, okay. It was in a different place the last time I looked. Toolbox, and there we go. All of our controls again. So checkboxes. We need to do some checkboxes pretty soon. Drop-down menus. You can put a menu bar up at the top of your application. You can make a pretty nice looking application with these things. If I was going to do a graphical user interface for a user and they didn't specify what language I was going to use, I'd use C# in one of these forms-based applications, because you can really do some rapid prototyping and get it done really fast. People used to use Visual Basic for that purpose. But I'd rather program in something that looks like C++ or Java. We know what the properties window is. We know what an error list is. So in the properties window, you can change the appearance, size, and color of a window. It contains about 100 properties. Test question. No, I'm kidding. Property names in alphabetical order, except for name, which ought to be up at the top. So creating a form in the IDE. An accept button gets or sets the button on the form that is clicked when the user presses the enter key. Background color. Cancel. For color. Let's go take a look at that. I'm really curious about that accept button property. So if I have a form here, and if I scroll up here, do I see an accept button? Can't say that I do. Well, they're not in alphabetical. If this button is clicked, this is what, okay, that's pretty neat. A lot of times people want to change the behavior of an application so that if you hit the enter key, it does something special. You know, it may go on to the next line or whatever. Here is one way you can specify. Another way is that you can usually attach a key binding to a specific object so that it accepts all, all carriage returns. But in Windows Forms and perhaps WPF, I'd have to go back and look. Looks like you can specify it right there in the properties for the window itself. So for example, I'm just going to drag a button out. I may wind up deleting it, although what kind of problems that'll cause. There's my button, and I'm going to go back to my window by clicking on the window and saying I want my accept button to be button 1. So that is what's going to trigger every time I hit the enter key. Then I'm going to double click on this. And whatever happens on button 1 click would happen every time I hit the enter key on that form. Now I'm going to have to delete that if I delete the button. One thing we'll see that's different is that we don't see the XML for the application, because this is WinForms, not WPF, and WinForms came before WPF. Whether something is visible or not. That's the visible attribute, the foreground color, the background color. And what's kind of cool is you can change all this stuff programmatically. You can make things invisible or visible. You can gray them out so that the enter button is grayed out until you typed in all the fields on the data. You can change the text, of course. We've seen that. You can change the colors. They type in an error message, and then that thing flashes red. Now, you can't use red as your only indicator that something is wrong, because for the colorblind users or people using screen readers, that would not work. So we can drag controls, such as a button, onto the form. You can relocate the control, or you can delete it. I'm stepping through these pretty quickly because we have done all of this. What is a button? It's a clickable object that allows a user to interact with the GUI. By default, the first button on the form is named button 1. You should probably change the name to something meaningful. We can do that. We can go back to our thing, scroll up to the top, and the name of it used to be button 1. And we can change this one to awesome button. And by the way, guys, I'm not really, for those of y'all doing this at home, I'm not expecting you to type this in. I mean, I'm not expecting you to follow along. We're just kind of going through the PowerPoint here. If you want to follow along for the experience, that's cool.
Are you still paused?
I hope not. Nope, I'm not paused. Alrighty. Yep, he's still counting. Alrighty. Then if we want to change the text of it, we can do that as well. Annoyingly, you have to scroll all the way down to text. We found other ways of doing it previously. I'm not seeing how to do it right now, so I'm going to change the name of it to awesome. And then if I double click on this, what I'm going to see is that it didn't actually change the name of my method itself. It still says button 1 click because I created it before I changed the name. If I'd changed the name first and then double clicked it to create the method, then it'd have a different name. You can rename your method by going to refactor rename. Instead of button 1 click, you could do awesome button click. If you feel like it, you could also change any comments that reference it, any strings that referenced it. Okay, so there we go. It's kind of giving us a little preview of what it's going to do, and it changes it. So we go back over here. In the form designer, we can look at the events that are tied to that button. And events are different things that can happen to the button. Inside the program itself, behind the scenes, we don't see it. There's an event handling loop. And the windows, anytime you click on it, anytime you move it, anytime you tab through it, all of those stuff generate events. And if the event handler wasn't working, then nothing would happen. And you've seen that happen on your Windows applications before. It says stop responding. That means that the event handling loop is frozen for whatever reasons. And there's not much you can do about that unless you kill the app or whatever. So your goal is to make sure that your event loop doesn't die. What's ideal is if the event handler is actually generating new threads to handle the button clicks. A thread is a process, well, kind of a sub-process that runs behind the scenes, and it runs in parallel with the process that's handling your window itself. And that way, if you click the button, the application doesn't hang while the button method is being processed. Because what if that button handling, took 10 seconds before it generated an answer? You wouldn't want your window to be frozen and grayed out while that was happening. And we'll test that after a little while. We'll make a button that just sits there and waits for a while before it posts its answer to see what happens to the rest of the interface. So if somebody drags and drops something into our button, they grab an image file and they drop it onto a field on there, that's one of the things that you can handle. You could create an event for that. If we needed to delete, if we wanted to no longer associate our button with a method, for example, we delete the method, then we could go and we could delete the click handler right there. I would just go to the events, which is a little lightning bolt, highlight click, backspace over it, and then that method is no longer invoked. I could go and safely delete it. And you'll see things like that if you go into your code and delete your method or comment it out or something like that. The code doesn't really know it's gone. So I'm going to comment it out with a /*/. Now the method no longer exists. Am I going to be able to build it? Rebuild solution. I get an error. The error is cannot find the awesome button click. You could either go in and comment it, you could add a new one with the same name, or you could go back and you could change that in your form designer. Yeah. Why is it not letting me get to my form designer? Why is it posting this nasty message? I just want to edit the page. Okay, ignore and continue. Yeah, sure. Alright, that broke it. Apparently that's not the order in which you want to do things. Delete the button first before you delete the method. Sadder but wiser are we. Things you can do for the button. You can change its background color, whether it's enabled or not. What does it mean whether a button is enabled? If it's grayed out, you can't click on it. Y'all have seen those in controls. Things that only ungray after you've typed and retyped your password and they're the same. That kind of thing. So adding functionality to a button is easy with the IDE. After dragging the button onto the form, you double click on it to create a method that executes when the user clicks the button. Okay, we know that. You drag a button out there, you double click on it. Now that doesn't mean you double click on everything. If I drag a text field out, whoops, wrong thing, go away. If I drag a text field out here, I need to change it to just common controls, not all of them. Pop that out there, and then I double click on it. It's going to create a method for it, but that method, text changed, you really probably don't want it change this being invoked every time the user types something into it. Maybe you do, maybe you do, maybe you want it to be, checking to see if it's a valid password or not, and to not turn green, until they finish typing it. But normally you don't want that being invoked just because they type something. So you're not going to want a method for every single object you put down there, especially a label. Put a label down there. You click on the label unless you're trying to fill your application full of Easter eggs, that make it do things based on random clicks. You're not going to want to create a method. And so typically what happens is after students have been editing one of these forms for a while, they wind up with a whole bunch of extraneous methods. And we have just seen that if you delete the method, then bad things happen. So I guess I'm just going to recommend at this point that you go ahead and leave the methods there. And then if you really want to clean them up, you go and change the property in the event list first before you remove the method. I got to try it again. I'm going to delete the method, rebuild it, rebuild the solution, error, blah, blah, blah. Are you missing a using directory or an assembly reference? No, we're not. All we did is we deleted. Alrighty. Does this tell us how to fix it on the spot? Go to code and add the method. The code within the method initialize component is generated by the designer and should not be manually modified. Alrighty. Twice I've convinced myself that you should never delete the method without removing the event handler first. That is picky. And we've just verified that it does the same thing whether you're using Windows Visual Studio 2017 or 2012 or 2013, whatever, antiquated version.
Is there a reason that these forms are partial classes? It says public partial class. I didn't know that had any meaning to it.
Yeah, let's see what the partial keyword does. The question is when we're looking at the file itself, it just says partial class. Probably means that the rest of the class is defined somewhere else. It'd be interesting to go and find where that is defined. Let's go look. Partial class C#. It is possible to split the definition of a class into two or more source files. So it means that the rest of the class is defined somewhere else. So what Java forces us to do is to inherit from the class in order to extend it. And what C# is doing is it's saying, oh, we're just adding stuff onto the class. That's kind of an interesting difference between them. So, you will see many generated statements, some confusing, most of which you can ignore. It creates all the boilerplate to support running the application. You write code between the curly braces of the method you just added. If you change the name property of the button 1, a subsequently created click method will have the same name. So you could change the name of it, you could double click on it and create a new method. Or you can just right click on the name of the method and do refactor and rename it that way. So events. Events are generated to perform a task when the user interacts with a GUI object. Now there are a whole bunch of event handlers already built into it, like what happens if you click close on it. And then there's a lot that you can add as you create your own objects. So the click event occurs when a user clicks on the object. So what are labels? You display text. The user can't type into them. You can change its text property to display any text you like. I love these little pictures. Just step through the PowerPoint yourself because obviously you're not going to be able to see these on the video. But they've dragged the label out onto the form. And then you can go over here to the text and to change the text. So what it says here is enter a number. May as well do this. Kind of a rehash. Alrighty, so label, drag that out there. I double clicked on it, which is my mistake because I wanted to change the text of it, so now I have an extraneous method for it. I'm going to go and remove the binding to that event handler, so I'm going to click on the lightning bolt on the properties, come over here and try to clear that entire field out. Alright, now there is no event handler for that label. It's still in our code. I can flip back to the code and now I can safely remove the handler for that. And then you're probably, if you're like me, going to double click it again by accident again and recreate it. And like I said, an empty event handler is not a big deal. It just means that if you click on it, it's going to do nothing, and that's okay. It's what we wanted anyways. So we could change the text of that to enter a number. I'm not going to bother. So text boxes. The user can enter input data through them. And you can also freeze them so that the user can't change them, in which case they become kind of an output only kind of thing. And I've done that before because I like the way that the text box looks, you know, as opposed to how the label looks. But that's kind of lazy. So if a user is supposed to enter data into the text box, you want to start with its text property empty. Because if you drag a text box out there, it's not empty. When I grab my text box out there, I go back to its alphabetical listing in properties. I give it a better name. Like favorite number. What I actually do is I prefix the name of the text box with the word text, or even the word text box, just to indicate when I'm looking at it what it is. So I would call this, and you can't see what I'm typing here, text box underscore fav number. And it looks like it didn't fill it in with any default data. So good enough. If we wanted it to be filled with some default data, like a 0 or something, then we could do that. We just have to come over here, scroll down to the text, and make it say my favorite number is 0. So there we go. We see 0 sitting there inside the favorite number tab, text box. So it is a string by default. If you pull data out of it, it is in the form of a string, and you have to convert it. Just like if you used console.read, which returns a string. And this is pretty much true of most graphical design or user interface data entry. You get strings out of them, which is why you can get lazy if you're doing a Java application and use next, next int, next float, next double. I really ought to teach people just to use .next and to always do the conversions themselves, because when you start writing graphical interfaces or you're pulling data in off the internet, very, very, very often it's just going to be a string, and it's up to you to interpret it how you wish. So what they're doing is they're making a form here that says enter a number, enter another number, click to add. Yeah, we wrote one that says multiply instead. And here's their text. They declared 3 integers, one called num1, one called num2, one called sum. So they did convert to int32, and they did another convert to int32. And what is the difference between how we were doing it and how the textbook is showing us?
We do try parse, but...
Right, we use try parse. And the reason we use try parse is because this conversion will fail if it is bad, if the data is in an incorrect format.
However, so what would that one do if the data was...
Yeah, if the data is incorrect, let's find out. So I'm going to go back into here. I'm going to drag another button out. I'm going to double click on the button, and I'm going to say int I, that's going to be my value, string s is equal to, and what did I call my button? Text box underscore fave number dot text. Now I have a string, and I'm going to try to convert it just like they did. I equals convert dot to int 32, the string. Let's find out what it does, if anything, if we type in bad data.
Well, wouldn't you have to set, or,
Well, yeah, I should be setting a label or something to the output, but I'm not going to even do that. Have I completely borked it by what I did?
Do you need to rebuild it before you play it, or does that matter?
I probably do. Let's completely rebuild it. Yeah, when I deleted the handler, it apparently did terrible things to this. So if you were following along with me and you deleted the handler, it's probably about time you made a new project. Windows Form application, okay. I'm going to drag another text box out there. I'm going to drag another button out there and just do the same thing. I should have just copied this stuff, shouldn't I? I'm going to give the text box a slightly better name than just text box. So I need to go over here, look at the properties. The name of the text box is no longer text box 1. Heck, I'm just going to leave it text box 1, and I'm going to double click on button 1. Same kind of thing. Int I, string s. S is equal to text box 1 dot text. All right, I'm going to make a comment for you Java developers, and you who haven't taken Java are going to be kind of annoyed by all the times I do this. But take a look at this. Text box 1 dot text is equal to hello. We are getting the text out as though it is a variable, right? Not an encapsulated field.
that's true.
So that's just something to consider. And later on, I believe we'll see that you can actually make it so that it is an encapsulated field, and you have a special setter, mutator, that's invoked when you do this. Okay, but now I want to try the convert. I is equal to convert dot to int 32, parentheses, the string that we're passing in. Now we're going to try it. Rebuild the solution. Start it. All right. I'm going to type in a good number to see its behavior. Great. Now I'm going to type in some garbage. And it blows up. An unhandled exception. Now the user is probably not going to see all these things. This is kind of debug stuff. Break when this exception type is thrown, blah, blah, blah. So if we compile this for a release rather than compile it for debug, then we might see different options if that generated, but it's never going to work. That is just flat out an error. Now you could capture the error. You could use exception handling so that if that kind of error occurs, open exception handler. That's kind of neat. Oh, all of that. Alrighty. So I don't recommend using convert to int32 even though the syntax is cleaner. It's a lot cleaner. But that's why right from the get-go I try to get y'all used to using try-parse. Hush. Always clicking on the wrong red thing. Okay. So to execute, select debug and then start without debugging. Or press Control F5. Or even better, just grab the big green arrow. But I always build it first. Make sure that I have the everything recompiled. The period during which you design a program is called design time. When you execute the program, that stage is called runtime. All right, glad to know that. So focus. Focus defines which control is active. You can change the focus. For example, if somebody hits enter and it saves the data, then you may want to relocate the cursor back into your text box so that they can type something in again. So if they're doing a whole bunch of data entry and they've typed in a form and they're on the last line and they hit enter, you might want to move the cursor back up to the top so they can start typing in more data. The way the control can be given focus, the user can click on it or they can click the tab key. So I'm just going to rebuild this, click start again, and we will see that if you hit the tab key, it'll flip to the button. And if you're a Mac user, that looks pretty weird. I do not believe that you can tab over to the buttons on a Mac application usually. If it's a form inside a browser, yeah, but if it's a native Mac application. So the tab order is represented by a sequential number known as the tab index. And this can get messed up. So what is tab order? Tab order means you saw me tabbing and it went from the input field to the button. So I'm going to go back to the designer. I'm going to drop a few more input fields down. Text box, okay. I want that one there. And then I want another one. Oh, maybe I'll stick it on top because I need some extra room. Now watch what's going to happen when I run it. Tabbing starts in the middle now. And then I hit the next button, the tab, and it goes down here to button 1. And then it goes to the bottom. And then it goes back up to the top. So we would want to fix that. That is a pretty unprofessional application. And you can change the tab order. You can say, okay, I want this one to be index 0, this one to be index 1, this one could be index 2, and this one could be index 3. So unless otherwise specified, the first control to receive focus will have tab index 0 because it was the first one that was plopped onto the form. They don't show how to change it.
Can you go back to that one we just saw?
Yeah, I'll go back to that one.
Oh no, go forward one more. We use the same format strings as a script. String that format. Look better.
Right, so string.format accepts the same kind of parameters that console.write does. It's got the same placeholders, specify that something is going to be a floating point with 2 decimals, things like that. So if you need to change the tab order, I believe you can do it programmatically. Well, through the properties, I believe you can drag something out over here, click on it, go to the properties, and find the tab index right there. But Visual Studio also gives you a nice way of doing it. You can go to View, Tab Order, and then just click on them in the order that you want the tab to work. So the top one, the second one, the third one, and the fourth one.
I've noticed sometimes on a lot of websites when you are trying to tab to the next one, it sends you far off into something that was on the side, or I don't know why.
Right. In websites, the tab order is defined due to how they are defined in the HTML. So that means that they just put the entry fields in a different order than what you were expecting, and somebody needs to go and clean that back up. So now if we run it, rebuild solution, start, our tabs behave the way we want them to. 1, 2, 3, 4. We are almost done with the chapter. I'm going to plan on us blazing ahead and doing the entire chapter because we have already done every single thing on here pretty much. Yeah, so we know how to change a label's font, right? We go over here, we click something, could be a label, could be anything, could be our button, and then we find the properties for it. You have all these things about appearance. Here's the font. You don't want it a Microsoft Sans serif. Microsoft's new favorite font is now Segoe UI. So where's my button to select the font? So well, it removed my font selector. So, all right. So now it looks like a slightly more modern Windows application. It's actually a little bit harder for me to read. I would boost the size of it. I'm kind of thinking that that default one was actually better than Segoe UI was. So most fonts are proportional fonts, meaning that different characters have different pitches or widths. So an I is a very narrow little character, right? A W is a very wide character. However, in your code editors, you don't want a proportional font. So if I go to Notepad and I start typing stuff, I'd like for my I's and my W's to be the same width. So I is equal to 3.4, and then W is equal to 1.2, whatever. If I change that to a proportional font, not a console font, or a typewriter font, like Lucida Sans, now you can see that stuff no longer lines up, which is great for reading. You know, reading a typewriter font, a monospace font, a fixed pitch font, if we're going to get even more technical in their name. Most people just call them monospace. Then every character occupies the same width. So your code editor is set by default to do that.
How can you tell if it's a proportional font or a monospace font?
You just choose it.
Yeah, just see and look at. Okay.
Right. How do you tell the difference? Basically, you just run through your fonts, open Word or something like that, and they usually have the name console or mono, something like that in them. Courier is the probably the default monospace font that people go to because it's supported everywhere. You can use it in Windows Forms. It's built into all the browsers. So naming your forms, that provides the name, gives you the ability to understand it when you're coding it. The user never sees the names, but you do. So we should provide reasonable name property values. We don't just want to call them text box 1, 2, 3, and 4. All right, so since every textbook tells us differently how to name these things, I'm going to read what it says here, and I don't care if you do it. Start control names with a lowercase letter and use camel casing. Okay, that sounds good to me. If you're going to create a variable, go ahead. Start it with a lowercase letter. Now, I've been demoing changing the names to things like textbox underscore first name, in which case I left it a capital T. Does that follow that? No, not really. Is another editor, another programmer who comes and looks at your code going to be able to understand what it does? Yeah, they will. One thing you can do is, and this is sort of an offshoot of what's known as the Hungarian naming convention, which I'm absolutely not going to get into. But if you want, you could take a text box, give it a name like this. TB for text box, TB first name. And then pick the second one and give it another name. TB last name. That kind of thing. And so when you're looking at the code and you see a whole bunch of variables named TB this and TB that, you can start to associate pretty quickly, oh, those are referencing text boxes. Because if you just give it a name of first name with no indication of what it is, and then you give this thing last name with no indication of what it is, and then you switch to your code and you type in, string is equal to last name, somebody editing this might think that that's just a string. It's giving us an error because it's a controller. They might get frustrated that it's giving them an error. Could we set this equal to a variable? Yeah, we could. It's a text box, right? I could create a text box variable that referenced that last name variable. So are you going to do this as a introductory programmer? Probably not. But now I could do this. My is equal to last name. So if we were way down in the middle of the code and it said my is equal to last name, just in isolation, yeah, you could go and find out what my is, or you could go and find out what last name is. Quite often, you can go and do peak definition, and it'll show you how it was defined. So that's kind of nice. Or you can right-click and say go to definition, and you'll see how it was defined. Anyways, try to give them good names. It also says use the type of the object in the name. I agree with that. The whole word text box would be great. If you're going to create little initials, that's okay. If you see a whole bunch of code and the variables all begin like this, int I age, int I weight, int I whatever, then you're probably looking at a programmer who learned how to program in the 80s, because this is a variant of what's known as Hungarian notation. The way Hungarian notation works is the first letter of the variable indicates its type. So if you had a whole bunch of W's, it'd be DH. If these were strings, it'd be SH. Nothing wrong with doing that.
So like how usually we have that BOK when we do stuff.
Right, so I've been kind of steering in that way because I did learn programming in the 80s. When I do bool BOK, what does that mean? It just means that it's a Boolean variable named OK. And then if I had another one that said B invalid, do you have to name your things the same things I do? No, but I find it helpful. Now, if you're following true Hungarian notation, which was proselytized and spread by Microsoft themselves in the 80s, then you do things like, okay, this is an array of ints named age, and this is an array of strings named names. And then there are other things, so like this is an index into the array of ints named age. Okay, are we going to do that? No, but I certainly don't mind putting the first letter in there to indicate what it is. And y'all have seen me doing that with that double DIN and string SIN, which looks kind of, bad and unbiblical or whatever. I could call that string S input, whatever. Could call this double D input, or I could give them just complete names that don't start with D. It's up to you. I just recommend that you try to name your variables consistently enough so that if you come back to it 5 years later, it's instantly obvious what it is, and then if somebody sits down. And if you work at a company and you see that somebody else's code is following some naming convention like that, then you can write more code that looks like it fits in.
So what's, I guess, the standard call for I guess how some people do like their Boolean variables, they'll say is okay or is this, like is valid, is invalid, like instead of having a B, it would be like is invalid or.
Yeah, what you do is, in this language you really only have a few choices. You could do either is B in, okay, I really hate variable names that have negatives in them. So if B valid is equal to true, that's totally fine. Or you can do if, by the way, don't put a semicolon here. Most common programming error ever is if you do that. Okay, or you can just do if B valid. That also works. If you feel like comparing it to false, if B valid is equal to false, that works. Or if not B valid. Pro programmers will do it that way and that way. I show interest programmers that first and then try to wean them to going into that. But they're both perfectly valid ways of doing it. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay. There is another data type. called bool with a question mark. And that has 3 possible values rather than true. You can set, I'm going to change the name of that just to B. You can say B is equal to true. You can say B is equal to false, or B has no value at all. Right? So it's actually got 3 states. And why would you do that? That way you could indicate whether we don't even know if this state is true or false yet. We haven't even checked. So you might have a, a third case going on there. This is the only language I know that supports that.
Surprised you remembered that from not doing this a long time ago. 2008.
It's been newer than that. 2012. That's when I last did a lot of
I thought you told me 2008 when the last time you did.
I think that was the first time. I may have been exaggerating when I said 2008. Okay, so you can rename a variable or a control. You just click rename, type the new variable name. Or if you're in code, you can click on it and then choose refactor. Correcting errors. You will often generate syntax errors. If you build or run a program, you'll see build failed. You should see an error dialog box. You should see an error list. And double-clicking on the error message will take you to the location in the code where the error was found. There were build errors. Would you like to continue and run the last successful build? And the answer to that is no. You never want to continue and build the last successful build. So I would click, do not even show this error again. Deleting an unwanted event handling method.
Hey.
Yeah, we've seen this problem.
You cannot just delete
It is,
the method.
yep, it is easy to inadvertently double-click a control. You can just leave it in there. That's considered, bad form. That's like wearing your shirt inside out or, whatever. You cannot just delete the method. Behind the scenes, other code will have been created that refers to that method. So you got to go to Properties, click on its Events button, select the button you want to eliminate, and delete the method name. Now, does that really delete the method itself? Let's find out. I'm going to go in here, double-click on button to create my valuable button code. But then later on, I decide I really hate that. I clicked on it by mistake. So I'm going to go to Events. So I'm going to choose the lightning bolt down here in Properties. And there's click there. And I'm going to backspace over that. If I go back to the code, that's still there. Right? Well, it wiped it out, but it left the handler. It says 0 references. So at least you know that now it's safe to get rid of it. And we have one reference to this. This is the constructor for our form. And you know what a constructor is? It's a method that is invoked as the class is being built, as the object is being built. So there's something called initialize component. Let's see if we can find the source for initialize component. Go to definition. Alrighty.
For designers support, not
Yeah.
modify.
So this is inside some stuff that we're not supposed to change. The text, the designer, is handling all of this behind the scenes. And if you go in and you start hacking this and then you open up the form designer again, it'll probably do the same thing that we saw with the method handler, which is just choke and display a message and erase your window. And if you do this in Java NetBeans form designer, it'll just say that it can't edit it, which I appreciate it more than just wiping it all out like C# did. But so if there are portions of the code grayed out or with a mark saying that you should not modify it, abide by that. So, deciding which interface to use. You have learned how to create console applications and GUI applications. Both types contain the basic building blocks. Graphical applications look snazzy. They're easier to use. They take a little longer to develop. Console applications, simpler. May be better when learning new logical constructs. So I kind of like toggling between them, but you are free, unless I specify otherwise, to go ahead and create a GUI application, even if I demonstrate it as a console application. You know, just think to yourself, would this be better suited for one than the other? Now, for that multiply application, for example, did it really matter if we implemented it one way or the other? Not really. But if we're doing a data entry one where where we're entering student information and we have to type in their name and their age and stuff like that, you could make a real cool GUI application that would gather all that information before it added it to the array. And it would be awesome. And I would encourage you to do that if you have the time, because you're learning more about programming. But it takes more time to do it. Twice as long, 3 times as long, 10 times as long. Depends on how comfortable you get in it. But it's certainly a good skill to learn. So, summary. Forms are GUI objects that provide an interface. So the entire window is an object. I would say that a form is a collection of GUI objects, really. Not just that a form is a GUI object, but it's true that the window is a GUI object unto itself. The toolbox displays a list of available controls, including buttons, checkboxes, and labels. How rude of us to mention checkbox, but then not show it in use. So we'll do that maybe the next time. Labels display the text, and if we give reasonable name properties you place on a form, then the code is more reasonable. And if you build or run an application that contains a syntax error, you see build failed. Hopefully you can find the problem. Both console and GUI applications can contain variables and constants, decisions, loops, arrays, and calls to other methods. And GUI applications look snazzy, contain controls. It's a GUI world. When was the last time you interacted with a console application, unless you're a system administrator?
That's true.
So in my homework, I had the question, why does console.readKey close the program? It doesn't close the program. The program is going to close anyway. It's just that console.readKey prevents it from closing until you hit the enter key. It's like adding input parentheses in parentheses to the bottom of your Python program to stop the Python window from closing. So why did we add console.readKey? Because otherwise you run it and it just closes the window immediately and you didn't get to see your output. And you can go into Visual Studio and find something that you can configure that would keep the output window around even after it is finished running. And if you feel like finding that, great. Go ahead and leave console.readKey in just for me, because I don't configure that because it's not by default, and I like just sticking to the default unless we need to know otherwise. All right, this all made sense, guys?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Actually, it's been seen before.
So that's the end of this lecture. There's really nothing to turn in. So look for the next video where we'll do another tutorial.